There couldn't be a more challenging time to bring in a budget for any finance minister in the recent past. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has undoubtedly a tough time ahead. Growth is estimated to settle at 5% for 2019-20, the slowest in 11 years. The fiscal deficit target of 3.3% is looking more and more like a pipe dream. GST revenues are below expectations, and the big divestment plans have still not fully materialized. Add to this an economy where demand is slowing, manufacturing is sluggish, and credit offtake low. It's a tough gig, no doubt. As we kick off our series of budget special coverage on the India development debate, we look at how this is going to be more than just an accounting system. It has to be a vision statement for how this government and the finance ministry is going to shake India out of the slump we find ourselves in. So what can this budget do to shake things up? When one of the proposals doing the rounds to reduce imports is restricting the number of alcohol bottles Indians can buy at duty-free, the question also is, do we have a plan? To speak more on this, I'm joined today by Arvind Virmani, Chairman, Foundation for Economic Growth and Welfare, and Reetika, Khera, Associate Professor at IIM Ahmedabad. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us on the show today. Mr. Virmani, let me begin with a very, very basic question, and to put into perspective, because this is kicking off our budget coverage on the show, really, how much can we expect from that one day and that one set of announcements, considering the broader economic situation?
Given the developments over the last 5 years, it is very important that the small and medium, of course, we've already had the corporate tax changes. We need to stimulate the small business, the ones which have kind of been negatively affected. I mean, call it the black economy or whatever, though our long-term purpose is to shift the economy from black to white, but perhaps that has not happened as effectively as one would have hoped. To some extent, the black economy has declined more than the white has recovered. So one has to focus on household enterprises, small business. And for that, in my view, the direct tax code is absolutely critical element. And of course, the second is GST. Now, GST is not directly within the purview of the budget, given that it's determined by the GST Council, but one can hope that the Union Minister of Finance will give some indication on that. So really where she has the greatest authority and the greatest opportunity is in simplifying the direct tax code. I'm sure in your program, in other business programs, we have discussed this huge book, this huge complicated direct code that we have now.
Yes.
And I've talked to many small businesses and etc. It's really a nightmare. So I hope she will lay the grounds or do move forward in simplifying the direct tax code.
Okay, some key messaging over there. You know, now we're talking on a day when the IMF has actually lowered the Indian growth forecast for 2021, FY21 by 120 bips actually to 5.8%. So while everyone's hopeful that we have bottomed out, Reetika, Khera, do you agree with Mr. Virmani's assessment that we're at the bottom of this cycle? And of course, we'll come by and by to what can be done. But let's first get a clear idea of where we think we stand.
Right. So I have to admit that I'm not in a very good position to predict what's going to happen in the future. That's certainly not my strength. But what I would like to say is that even a 5% growth is not an unhealthy rate of growth for the GDP. Even at a time when the growth rate was 7 or 8%. The fruits of that were not really being shared by a very large chunk of the population. So as much as the growth rate matters, it also depends on which sectors have been growing or not growing. And as you can imagine, with a lower level of growth of the economy, that section which was left out earlier is likely to be feeling the squeeze much more. So I think one has to think not only about the overall GDP growth rate, but look sector-wise. And I know that at least at one point, things like financial services were growing at a very healthy rate, even when the overall growth rate was coming down. And that really is a sector that doesn't affect a very large chunk of the population. To the extent that this slowdown is a demand side problem, and I think many people have been saying that this is a demand side problem, these distributional issues become very important, right? So if the growth rate is concentrated at the top end of the economy, that's the end that has a very low marginal propensity to consume. And what you really need to do is to shift or put money in the hands of the middle class or the poor, whose propensity to consume is much more, and they're likely to boost aggregate demand. So in that sense, this move of the government a few months ago of giving these corporate tax cuts, I don't think was a particularly sensible move, because the corporate sector is not in business to do charity. They're in business to do business, which is to make profits. And so if you want to stimulate demand, the better way I would imagine is to put money in rural India, and of course then to beef up programs like the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which really, I mean, I can speak a fair bit about the kinds of reforms that are required there, because the reform that's required is not just increasing the budget, but maybe I should come to that a little bit later.
Okay.
So I would say that the overall growth rate is still not something to be,
Okay.
so
Good point. Yeah,
about.
so Reetika says she's not necessarily alarmed by the 5%. It's about where the money goes. Here, let me bring in this interesting report today, an Oxfam report, which talks about the massive disparity of incomes within India, and it's a study which reveals that the top 1% of India holds over 42% of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% account for just 2.8% of the wealth. Now, again, I'm not going into suggesting massive socialist kind of moves. We have to encourage the urge to invest more, to grow businesses, and that's how economic prosperity will also grow. But Mr. Virmani, I just want to get you in on this point about increasing demand. And is the only way to increase incomes? We've seen a plethora of suggestions. Cut the personal income tax, increase Manrega, or maybe make it more efficient, like Reetika perhaps is suggesting. Do you think that that should be the focus? And if you're ready to stretch our fiscal deficit, which now by all accounts we seem to be, is that where we should be spending the money?
I don't agree with people who say that nothing should be done except for consumption. Now, clearly, there are pockets of consumption which have suffered very strongly, among them automobiles, for example, where we do have data. There may be other areas where, I don't see that very clearly in the data. For example, people had said that food is suffering. You look at the IIP, well, it's not suffering. So that's the first point. Secondly, what should be done about it? Clearly, there are other sources. The consumption decline comes because of, and I basically identified three fundamental sources. One was what I hinted at, this whole crusade against black economy. The second is the fiscal, which was not, on one hand, we were trying to meet these targets, and on other side, we were making somewhat ad hoc increases in the tax rate. And the third, of course, is the monetary credit thing, which I have emphasized. Now, given this analysis, to my view, stimulating the small-scale sector, both by clearing the credit channels which go to the small-scale sector, and what I said, the reform of the things which have hurt them, which is the direct tax code and the GST, is absolutely critical. That does not mean that we should do nothing about pumping consumption into the economy, but the most appropriate way, in my view, of doing that is, for example, by shifting subsidies on fertilizer to programs like PM Kisan and Manrega.
Okay. Now, on the fiscal deficit, just quick word from you, Mr. Virmani. Do you agree that 3.3 is not going to happen? There have been reports today that off-budget items will be added, which could increase that number significantly. Some may say best to start with a clean slate. At least let's get a clear assessment of where we stand.
Right. So there are two parts to this. We have this expression in macro. It's called automatic stabilizers. So the decline in GDP to 7.5% nominal, which has already occurred, reduces the denominator and reduces revenues from various estimates. I have not done the estimation myself, but plausible numbers which I have heard is between 0.3 and 0.4. So that has already increased automatically with the decline in GDP. Now, if you bring the off-budget items into it, that will be a big change, because the off-budget is not a new thing. I remember 10, 15 years ago, we were discussing these things about how the food stuff, FCI and so on, the food corporation stocks are outside the budget. So clean slate, yes, but I think the more important part of the clean slate is to give all the payments which are pending. Now, the finance minister has already, I think,
they've already promised to do that.
Said that they would accelerate.
Yes, they've already promised to do that. One can only assume.
That's right. So putting all these things together, putting all this thing together will clearly raise the deficit number by more than 0.5%.
Okay, and most experts say they're okay with that if there's clarity on where that money is being spent. Reetika, let me come back to the point that you wanted to elaborate about. You spoke about, the Manrega scheme and other schemes like that. Do you think that pumping more money in that direction is going to be enough? And do you agree with the point of view that Mr. Virmani is putting forward, that just focusing on increasing more money in the hands of people and thereby pushing demand is not going to suffice at this point?
Right. So let me talk about NREGA first, this National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. For the past 2 or 3 years, the budget for NREGA has been about 0.3% of the GDP. Yeah, and so even if you were to double the budget for NREGA, it would go to 0.6% of the GDP. And I'm making this point to make clear that, because, the minute you ask for more money for these programs, people say you're being fiscally irresponsible. And of course, the doubling to 0.6% of the GDP is not a small measure. But I do still feel that in people's minds, the budget of NREGA is wildly exaggerated. People feel like we are spending like huge amounts of money, maybe 1% or 2% of the GDP. It's not like that, and we should at least put that number in perspective. The second thing is that in real terms, the money for this program has been declining for the past few years. And like I said, it's not just the budget which matters. What has also happened in the past few years is that people are not getting paid on time. The uncertainty about being paid has gone up quite considerably in some pockets of the country at least. And some of this is not corruption related. It's technology related. What happened in the past few years is that bank accounts got linked to Aadhaar. And then as a second step, they were mapped to this NPCI mapper. And as a result of that, a lot of wages are getting misdirected. There's an ISB study, ISB Hyderabad study, which is estimating that between 25 to 40% of wages were misdirected because of these issues in the banking system. So like I said, it's not just a question of raising budgets, but also taking into account that people need to be paid within a reasonable frame of time. The law says 15 days, but people may be waiting for up to 3 months or even more in some cases. Yeah. So that's the case for NREGA, because these are people not only who will provide a fillip to the aggregate demand in the economy, which seems to be necessary at the moment, but these are also people who are really on the brink of yes. I don't want to use the word unnecessarily, but in the past 3-4 years, we've been tracking hunger-related deaths, and the count has now increased to 90.
No, that's
so that's one side of the story. On the other side, I mean, it's not just about increasing demand. I agree with Mr. Virmani, of course. Many other things can possibly be done. One problem, I think, is that this war on black became actually a war on the informal sector. Not all cash is black.
No, I think you're echoing what Mr. Virmani said, that this war on black money has had its effect, has had its impact, but also some of the things that both of you on the panel are suggesting today are fairly incremental and more about execution. Is there no big bang idea that either of you would like to see? Since we're laying out our expectations, don't hold back. Mr. Virmani, do you think it's going to be merely enough by making sure that a machinery which should anyway be working works well?
No, I don't think, I think maybe I'm not clear. The direct tax code is a huge reform.
Yeah.
When I left the finance ministry in 2009, the code was ready. It's 10 years. It's not been able to be implemented. It's huge. Because why? Probably because there are huge vested interests. If you can overcome them and rationalize the direct tax system, there will be big benefits, not just next year, but over the next 5 to 10 years. So that is not small potato. It's a huge reform. Same with GST simplification. I have been looking in detail at the rates and exemptions and end-use exemption, which I've just started doing recently, and the vested interests come through in that. So simplifying the GST into, 90% of countries in the world have only one rate. We have like multiple rates which escape attention, 0.1, 0.2, there are multiple rates. So simplifying the GST into some kind of a reasonable system will again have big benefits for the informal sector. So I don't think these are small ticket reforms. They are big bang in my view.
And tough to actually implement unless you have a massive majority and nothing to worry about. And guess what? We do find ourselves in that situation. So let's hope some of that political will is directed in that direction. I've pretty much run out of time, but thank you so much, Arvind Virmani and Reetika Khera, for this conversation. It's the first in a series of special coverage on the India development debate running up to Budget Day, where we will look at every sector, every sphere, and actually see what the finance minister can do. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this evening. We'll be back here tomorrow.